There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They were the camouflage of a Tuesday night, or the quiet hum of a refrigerator, or the simple weight of a blanket. You don't recognize them as watershed events at the time. They are just breaths taken, seconds passing. It is only later, when you trace the map of your life backward, that you see them for what they were. The subtle shifting of tectonic plates, the quiet redirection of a river that will, in time, carve a new canyon through your entire world. For me, that moment felt like the warmth of another person's body seeping through my t-shirt in the blue-gray light of my own bedroom, a room that had, until then, been a fortress of solitude. He shifted, and the geography of the bed changed with him. Julian had been a continent of stillness beside me for hours, a warm, breathing landmass I was careful not to disturb. We had fallen into this strange, unspoken ritual over the past few months, a habit born of his exhaustion and my inability to ever say no to him. It was a friendship pressed into a new shape by crisis, his crisis, and I was the accommodating silence he needed. But this was different. In all the nights he had spent here, curled on his side of the mattress, a respectable DMZ of cotton sheet between us, he had never once crossed the border. Tonight, he did. A slow roll, a sleepy murmur that was not quite a word, and then his arm was slung over my waist, his chest was pressed against my back, and his breath was warm against the nape of my neck. My own breath caught in my throat, a traitorous little gasp that I prayed he didn't hear. Every nerve ending along my spine lit up, a switchboard suddenly overloaded with incoming signals. I was a photographer by trade, a professional observer. My life was spent cataloging the minute details of the world from a safe distance. The way light caught the dust motes in a sunbeam, the fleeting expression on a stranger's face, the intricate geometry of a shadow. I was trained to notice, to analyze, to feel the weight of a moment without ever becoming part of it. But this was not a photograph I could frame and hang on a wall. This was happening to me. The warmth of his body was not an abstract concept. It was a physical truth, a radiating heat that was dissolving the carefully constructed walls I had built around my feelings for him. My heart began a frantic, panicked rhythm against my ribs, a drumbeat for a war I had been trying to avoid for years. Was he asleep? He had to be. It was the only explanation that made sense, the only one that wouldn't shatter the fragile ecosystem of our friendship. Julian, in his waking hours, was a creature of casual, confident affection, a hand on the shoulder, a quick one-armed hug, but it was the affection of a brother, a teammate. It was safe. It was platonic. This was something else entirely. This was the quiet, possessive intimacy of a lover, an unconscious claim being staked in the dark. I lay there, rigid as a board, cataloging the sensations. The surprisingly heavy weight of his arm, the soft texture of his cotton pajama pants against the back of my legs, the faint, clean scent of his shampoo, a mix of sandalwood and something citrusy that I knew as well as my own. My mind raced, trying to develop this moment like a photograph in a darkroom, searching for the truth in the chemical bath of my own panic and hope. If he was asleep, this was an accident. A beautiful, terrifying, heart-stopping accident. If he was awake, then everything was about to change, and I had no idea if I was ready for it. Our story, like so many modern fables, began in the sterile, transient non-place of an airport terminal. It was a purgatory of delayed flights and overpriced coffee, a human sea of exhaustion and anxiety. I was returning from a shoot in Portland, a commission documenting the slow decay of old shipyards, and my flight back to Chicago had been grounded by a sudden, violent thunderstorm that had descended upon the Midwest like a biblical plague. I found a relatively clean spot on the floor near a charging station, resigned to a long night of watching the departures board flash with ever-increasing delays. He sat down near me about an hour into my vigil, dropping his carry-on with a sigh of such profound weariness that it seemed to carry the weight of the entire world. He was all sharp angles and restless energy, running a hand through dark, unruly hair that seemed to defy gravity. He wore a rumpled suit, the tie loosened, the top button of his shirt undone. He looked like a man who had been wrestling with a spreadsheet for 12 hours and lost. He caught me looking and offered a wry, tired smile. "Don't tell me," he said, his voice a low baritone that was surprisingly gentle. "Flight 1138 to O'Hare." I nodded. "The very same. I'm starting to think it's a myth. A flight that exists only on paper to give us false hope," he chuckled, a real, warm sound that cut through the terminal's monotonous drone. "I'm Julian, and I'm pretty sure my soul is currently being held hostage by this airline." He extended a hand, and I took it. His grip was firm, warm. "Leo," I said. And just like that, a connection was made, a tiny spark in the anonymous gloom. We spent the next 8 hours talking. It was the kind of conversation that only happens between strangers in liminal spaces, free from the weight of history or expectation. We talked about our jobs. His world of consulting, of PowerPoints and stakeholder meetings, felt as foreign to me as the surface of Mars, and he was fascinated by my life behind a lens, the way I chased light and shadow for a living. We talked about terrible movies, the best pizza in Chicago, the feeling of being perpetually jet-lagged, and the strange loneliness of traveling for work. What struck me most about Julian was his presence. When he listened, he really listened. His gaze was direct and engaged, his head tilted slightly, as if to catch every word. He had a way of making you feel like you were the only person in a crowded room, a rare and potent gift. For someone like me, who tended to exist at the edges of things, content to observe, it was both disarming and intoxicating. By the time we finally boarded our flight in the wee hours of the morning, bleary-eyed and running on stale pretzels, I felt like I had known him for years. We exchanged numbers as we deplaned at O'Hare, a gesture that usually feels like a polite formality, a digital handshake destined to be forgotten. But with Julian, it felt different. It felt like a promise. And it was. That airport conversation bled into text messages, then into coffee, then into a friendship that quickly became one of the central pillars of my life. He was the extrovert to my introvert, the kinetic energy to my still water. He pulled me out of my studio and into the world, to noisy bars and new restaurants and weekend trips I never would have taken on my own. In return, I offered him a sanctuary. My apartment became his refuge from the relentless pace of his life, a quiet harbor where he could drop anchor and just be. He would come over after a brutal week of travel, collapse onto my sofa, and talk for hours, or we would sit in comfortable silence, me editing photos, him reading a book. The friendship was easy, seamless. It was, for a long time, the most stable and rewarding relationship I had. The problem, of course, was me. The problem was that somewhere along the line, in the quiet moments between the laughter and the shared silences, the foundation of my feelings for him had begun to shift. It wasn't a sudden earthquake. It was a slow, imperceptible drift, the kind you only notice when you look up one day and realize the landscape is completely different. I started noticing things. The way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. The specific cadence of his laugh. The way he'd absent-mindedly play with a loose thread on his sweater when he was thinking. These were details I would normally capture with my camera, small, ephemeral truths. But now, I was capturing them with my heart, and they were developing into something dangerously close to love. I hid it, of course. I buried it so deep I could barely acknowledge it to myself. He was my best friend. He was straight. He had a girlfriend, Sarah, a perfectly nice corporate lawyer who was smart and beautiful and everything I was not. To confess my feelings would be to detonate a bomb in the middle of our lives, and the fallout would destroy the one thing I couldn't bear to lose, his friendship. So I became a master of emotional camouflage. I learned to keep my gaze steady when all I wanted to do was trace the line of his jaw. I learned to make my voice casual when he'd call, even if my heart was hammering against my ribs. I built a fortress of platonic affection around my secret, brick by careful brick, hoping the walls were high enough that no one, especially not him, could ever see what I was hiding inside. It was a lonely, exhausting performance, being the keeper of a one-sided love story. I was the sole cast member and the entire audience, playing my part in a silent theater of my own making. The shift began on a rainy Thursday in October. It was the kind of relentless, soul-dampening rain that turns the city into a watercolor of blurred grays and slick, dark asphalt. Julian was supposed to be in Boston, closing a deal. Instead, he showed up on my doorstep at 10 o'clock at night, looking like a ghost. He was soaked to the bone, his hair plastered to his forehead, his suit jacket clinging to his frame. But it was his eyes that stopped me. The usual light in them was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out, shell-shocked emptiness. He was holding his phone in one hand, the screen dark. "Sarah and I are done," he said, and the words came out flat, devoid of emotion, as if he were reporting on the weather. She ended it. Over the phone. While I was waiting for my flight, I pulled him inside, my mind racing. I felt a shameful, fleeting flicker of something that might have been hope, and I immediately extinguished it, disgusted with myself. This was not a victory. This was my friend, my best friend, standing in my hallway, completely shattered. The architect of his life had just watched a wrecking ball swing through the middle of his blueprints. I took his wet jacket, handed him a towel, and steered him towards the sofa. He sank into it, his body seeming to deflate, all the usual energy and charisma gone, leaving only a fragile, exhausted man in its place. He didn't cry. He just sat there, staring at the opposite wall, his hands limp in his lap. The breakup was the initial catalyst, the seismic event that shook his foundations. But it was compounded by his work. The project he was leading turned into a nightmare of impossible deadlines and clashing personalities. His nights grew longer, his travels more frequent and draining. The usual resilience he possessed began to fray at the edges. He was running on fumes, a machine being pushed far beyond its operational capacity. The confident, easygoing Julian I knew was being slowly eroded, replaced by a man who was anxious, bone-weary, and profoundly lonely. And in that state of quiet desperation, he started drifting towards my apartment more and more, not just as a refuge, but as a necessity. He was a ship caught in a storm, and my quiet, two-bedroom apartment was the only lighthouse he could see. He started canceling his own plans, showing up with takeout and a look of apology. "Do you mind?" he'd ask, already shrugging off his coat. I can't be alone in my place tonight. It's too quiet." I never minded. I would push aside my editing, and we would eat in comfortable silence, the only sounds the clinking of forks and the hum of the city outside my window. He stopped talking about the breakup after the first week. He stopped talking about work. The conversations became sparser, the silences longer. It was as if language itself had become too exhausting for him. He just needed to be in the presence of someone who expected nothing from him, who didn't need him to be on. I became that person. I was his anchor in the storm, and I was terrified of the weight of it, but I was more terrified of letting him drift away. I held on, providing a steady, silent presence, hoping it was enough. The ritual began subtly, as most profound changes do. It started with him falling asleep on my couch. We'd be watching a movie, some mindless action flick he'd chosen to numb his brain, and I'd look over to see his head had slumped against the armrest, his breathing deep and even. The first time it happened, I draped a blanket over him, turned off the lights, and went to my own bed, my heart aching with a strange mix of pity and tenderness. I left him there, a shipwrecked sailor washed up on the shore of my living room. This became a regular occurrence. He'd arrive, depleted and hollow-eyed, and within an hour, he'd be asleep, escaping into the only peace he could find. The transition from the couch to my bed happened about a month into this new, fragile dynamic. He had woken up on the sofa around 3 a.m., his neck stiff, his back aching. He stumbled into the kitchen where I was, as usual, wide awake, my mind buzzing with the proximity of him. He looked at me, his eyes clouded with sleep and exhaustion. "Leo," he said, his voice thick and rough. "This is a stupid question, but would it be terrible if I just slept in your bed? The couch is killing my back, and I know I won't sleep if I think I'm going to roll off. I promise I'll stay on my side. I just need a real mattress." His request was a perfectly calibrated mix of vulnerability and practicality. It was a plea wrapped in a logical excuse. He was offering plausible deniability for both of us. It wasn't about intimacy. It was about ergonomics. It wasn't about a need for closeness. It was about his spine. My mind screamed 1,000 warnings. This is a line. This is a boundary you cannot uncross. But my mouth, my traitorous, compassionate mouth, simply said, "Of course. Don't be ridiculous." That first night was an exercise in exquisite torture. I lay on the far edge of my queen-sized bed, my body ramrod straight, my muscles coiled tight. The space between us felt both cavernously large and suffocatingly small. I could hear every breath he took, every tiny shift of his body against the sheets. The air was charged with a new, unspoken current. I was acutely aware of him in a way that was almost painful. It was like trying to sleep next to a low-grade electrical fire. The danger was quiet, contained, but the potential for it to erupt into a full-blown inferno was terrifyingly real. I barely slept. I lay awake for hours, listening to the rhythm of his breathing, my own heart a frantic, offbeat counterpoint. But he slept. He slept like the dead, a deep, dreamless slumber that was clearly restorative. When I finally crept out of bed in the morning, he was still unconscious, one arm thrown over his head, his face relaxed and free from the tension that had been his constant companion for weeks. In sleep, he looked younger, more vulnerable. I stood there for a long moment, just watching him, feeling a wave of protective affection so powerful it almost buckled my knees. And I knew, in that moment, that I was lost. I would do this again. I would endure the sleepless nights and the emotional tightrope walk if it meant he could find this peace. And so, the ritual solidified. 2 or 3 nights a week, he would appear at my door, a silent question in his eyes, and I would nod him in. We would skip the pretense of a movie, and he would head straight for my bedroom, changing into the spare sweatpants and t-shirt he now kept in my bottom drawer. He would crawl into bed, turn his back to my side, and be asleep within minutes. I would follow later, sliding carefully under the covers, trying to make as little disturbance as possible. We never spoke of it. In the morning, he would be up and gone before I was, or we would share a quick, functional coffee, talking about the weather or the news, anything but the fact that we had just spent 8 hours sharing the most intimate space in my apartment. We were architects of a shared denial, building a structure of normalcy around a deeply abnormal situation. For me, those nights were a study in sensory overload. My darkroom training had taught me to be patient, to wait for the image to emerge from the darkness. Lying next to Julian was a similar process. I would lie in the dark and let the sensory data wash over me. The scent of him, that mix of his soap and his own unique smell, was a constant, comforting presence. The warmth radiating from his body was a physical fact, a heat that seemed to seep into my own bones, chasing away a chill I hadn't even realized I was carrying. Sometimes his foot would brush against mine, a fleeting, accidental touch that would send a jolt through my entire system. I would freeze, waiting for him to pull away, but he never did. He just slept on, oblivious, while I lay awake, deconstructing the meaning of a single, unconscious touch. The dynamic in the bed began to change, slowly, incrementally. The rigid, back-to-back formation began to soften. Sometimes I'd wake in the middle of the night to find we had both rolled onto our sides, facing each other, a few inches of space between our faces. I would watch the faint rise and fall of his chest, the way his eyelashes cast tiny shadows on his cheeks in the slivers of moonlight that cut through the blinds. These were moments of stolen intimacy, moments I felt guilty for observing, like I was reading a page from his diary. But I couldn't look away. It was a dangerous addiction, this proximity. It was feeding the part of me I was trying so hard to starve. The anxiety was a constant companion. Every night was a gamble. I was terrified of doing something in my sleep, of reaching out, of murmuring his name. I was terrified he would wake up one morning and realize the strangeness of our arrangement, that the plausible deniability would evaporate in the harsh light of day, and he would retreat, embarrassed and apologetic, leaving me with nothing but a hollow space in my bed and a gaping hole in my life. The ritual was both a balm and a poison. It was bringing me closer to him than I had ever dreamed possible, but it was also highlighting the vast, unbridgeable chasm between what we were and what I wanted us to be. I was living in a state of suspended animation, caught between a beautiful dream and the terrifying possibility of waking up. And then came the night he rolled over, the night he wrapped his arm around me, and the entire fragile structure of our denial began to groan under the strain. Lying there, with his arm draped over my waist and his breath warming my neck, I felt my carefully constructed defenses crumble to dust. The line between friend and something more, a line I had policed with such vigilance, had just been effortlessly erased by a single, sleepy gesture. My mind, the ever-present narrator, was frantically trying to write the story of this moment. He's asleep, it insisted. It's a reflex, a meaningless twitch. It's the product of exhaustion and a deep-seated need for comfort, nothing more. Don't read into it. Don't hope. But my body, my traitorous body, was telling a different story. It was responding to his touch with a sense of rightness, of homecoming, that defied all logic. It felt like a lock clicking into place, a puzzle piece finding its match. He sighed in his sleep, a soft, contented sound, and snuggled closer, his nose brushing against my hair. My heart did a painful, hopeful flip. This was the Julian I saw in my dreams, the one who sought me out, who chose me. But this wasn't real. It couldn't be. The gulf between the Julian who was my straight, grieving best friend and the man currently holding me as if I were his most precious possession was too vast to comprehend. To believe this was a conscious act would be to invite a level of devastation I wasn't sure I could survive. It was safer to believe in the dream. It was safer to remain the quiet observer, cataloging the moment without attaching any meaning to it. I closed my eyes, focusing on the rhythm of his breathing, trying to match it with my own, hoping to find some semblance of calm in the synchronized rise and fall of our chests. For the rest of the night, I did not move. I became a statue, a living effigy of stillness, guarding this accidental intimacy as if it were a sacred flame, terrified that the slightest movement might extinguish it forever. The ritual continued, but something had irrevocably shifted after that night. The unspoken tension in the room thickened, becoming a palpable presence. The border he had crossed in his sleep remained a disputed territory in our waking hours. He never mentioned it, and I certainly didn't. But the memory of it hung in the air between us. The embraces didn't happen again, not for a while. He returned to his side of the bed, a silent acknowledgement, perhaps, of a line that had been crossed. But the distance felt different now. It was no longer a neutral space. It was a charged vacuum, full of unspoken questions. I found myself watching him more closely, searching his face for any sign that he remembered, any flicker of awareness. But his expression was as unreadable as ever. He was a master of emotional containment, a fortress I could never breach. The breaking point came on a Tuesday, a night so ordinary it felt pre-written. A storm was raging outside, the wind howling and rattling the window frames, cocooning us in the small, warm world of my apartment. We were lying in bed, the usual chasm of sheet between us, but neither of us was asleep. I could feel his wakefulness, a restless energy radiating from his side of the bed. The silence stretched on, filled only by the sounds of the storm and our own quiet breathing. It felt different from our usual comfortable silences. This one was heavy, brittle, like a thin sheet of ice about to crack. "Leo." His voice was a low whisper, barely audible over the wind. It startled me, and my heart jumped into my throat. "Yeah," I managed, trying to keep my own voice steady. There was a long pause. I could hear the rustle of sheets as he shifted, turning to face me. I kept my back to him, my eyes fixed on the play of shadows on my bedroom wall. I was terrified of what was coming next. "Are you awake?" he asked, another stupid question, a gentle way of testing the waters. "I am now," I said, aiming for a note of light, teasing humor that I did not feel. Another silence. This one was even heavier. I could feel his gaze on my back, a tangible pressure. I felt like a specimen under a microscope, every inch of my feigned nonchalance being scrutinized. My entire body was screaming at me to turn around, to face him, to end this unbearable suspense. But I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by the fear of what I might see in his eyes. "Can I?" he started, then stopped. He took a breath. "Can I ask you something really weird?" My blood ran cold. This was it. The moment the ice cracks. "You can ask me anything, Jules. You know that." He was quiet for so long I thought he had changed his mind. I was about to break the tension with a joke when he finally spoke again, his voice so soft it was almost carried away by the storm. "Would it be okay," he whispered, the words tentative, fragile, "if I kissed you?" Time stopped. The wind, the rain, the city, my own frantic heartbeat. It all faded into a distant hum. The only thing that existed was his question, hanging in the air between us. It was not a proposition. It was not a demand. It was a plea for permission. It was the most vulnerable thing I had ever heard him say. It was a question that held the potential for both salvation and ruin. If I said yes, our friendship as we knew it was over. If I said no, I would be lying to him and to myself, and I would spend the rest of my life wondering. Slowly, as if moving through water, I turned over to face him. In the dim light filtering in from the street, I could just make out his silhouette, the dark shape of his eyes fixed on mine. He was waiting. He was holding his breath. I could see the fear and the uncertainty etched on his face, a mirror of my own. All my years of observing, of documenting emotion from a distance, had not prepared me for this. To be at the epicenter, to be a participant in the moment rather than its chronicler. I didn't trust my voice, so I just nodded. A single, small, terrifyingly definitive movement. He moved with an agonizing slowness, closing the small gap between us. I saw him hesitate for a fraction of a second, giving me one last chance to retreat. I didn't. He leaned in, and his lips met mine. It was not a passionate, movie screen kiss. It was gentle. It was tentative. It was questioning. It was unbelievably soft. It tasted of uncertainty and a deep, unnameable sadness. It was a confession whispered in the dark, a story told without words. I felt a single tear escape my eye and trace a cold path down my temple. He pulled back slightly, his forehead resting against mine, and his hand came up to cup my cheek, his thumb gently wiping the tear away. We stayed like that for a long time, breathing the same air, our worlds having just been irrevocably, terrifyingly, beautifully rearranged. The morning after was a masterpiece of avoidance. I woke up alone. The other side of the bed was cold, the pillow indented where his head had been. A note was on the nightstand, scrawled on a piece of scrap paper in his familiar, messy handwriting. Had to run. Early meeting. See you later. Jay? There was no mention of the kiss. No acknowledgement of the earthquake that had shaken my entire world. It was a message of such profound normalcy that it felt like a slap in the face. He was pretending it hadn't happened. He was trying to put everything back in the box, to slam the lid shut on the feelings he had so tentatively let out. A cold dread began to seep into my bones. I had misinterpreted everything. The kiss wasn't a confession. It was an aberration, a moment of grief-fueled confusion. He was lonely and sad, and he had reached for the nearest source of comfort, and I had been stupid enough to think it meant more. I had allowed my hope to build a narrative that was entirely fictional. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I had not only risked our friendship, I had made a fool of myself. I spent the day in a fog of self-recrimination, replaying the kiss over and over in my mind, dissecting it, searching for the clues I had missed, the signs that it was a mistake. He didn't text. He didn't call. The silence from him was a deafening roar. Each passing hour was another confirmation of my fears. By evening, the dread had curdled into a bitter cocktail of hurt and anger. How could he do this? How could he open that door, let me see a glimpse of something so beautiful, and then slam it shut in my face without a word of explanation? The man who had shared my bed, who had asked for permission to kiss me with such raw vulnerability, had vanished, replaced by a ghost who communicated through a cowardly, dismissive note. He avoided me for 2 weeks. 2 full weeks of silence. My texts went from casual, "Hey, you left your charger," to concerned, "Everything okay? Haven't heard from you," to unanswered. He didn't show up at my door. He didn't call. He had simply excised himself from my life. The pain of it was a dull, constant ache. The ritual I had both dreaded and craved was over, and its absence left a void that was colder and lonelier than any of the nights I had spent alone before him. The emptiness in my bed was a mocking reminder of what I had briefly held and foolishly lost. I had flown too close to the sun, and now I was falling, my wax wings melted away, with no one to catch me. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. The ambiguity was killing me more than a clean rejection ever could. I needed to know. I needed to hear it from him. I needed him to look me in the eye and tell me it was a mistake so I could begin the long, arduous process of gluing the pieces of my heart back together. I went to his apartment. It felt like a massive transgression, crossing into his territory after he had so clearly retreated from mine. I stood outside his door for a full 5 minutes, my heart hammering, my hand hovering over the buzzer. I almost turned back a dozen times, but the thought of living in this limbo for one more day was unbearable. I pressed the button. He opened the door, and for a second, he just stared at me. He looked terrible. There were dark circles under his eyes, and he had lost weight. He was wearing the same wrinkled shirt he'd probably slept in. The confident, charismatic consultant was gone. The man in front of me was haunted. "Leo," he said, his voice a rough croak. "We need to talk," I said, my own voice firmer than I expected. I pushed past him into the apartment. It was a mess. Takeout containers littered the coffee table, and piles of mail were stacked on every surface. The air was stale. This was not the apartment of a man who was doing fine. This was the den of someone who was hiding. He closed the door and leaned against it, not meeting my eyes. "I know. I'm sorry. I've been swamped." "Don't," I said, the anger finally bubbling to the surface. "Don't you dare lie to me, Julian. Not now. Don't insult my intelligence by telling me you've been swamped, you've been avoiding me. Just tell me why. Tell me the kiss was a mistake. Tell me you were drunk or sad or temporarily insane. Just tell me something, because this silence is destroying me." He finally looked at me, and his eyes were filled with a terrifying mix of panic and pain. "I can't," he whispered. "You can't what?" "You can't talk to me. I can't tell you it was a mistake," he said, his voice cracking. "Because it wasn't." The words hung in the air, a direct contradiction to his 2 weeks of behavior. I stared at him, my anger momentarily replaced by confusion. "Then what is this? Why have you been avoiding me? Why would you do that, kiss me like that, and then just disappear?" He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of pure distress. He started pacing the small living room like a caged animal. "Because I'm a coward, Leo. Okay, I'm a terrified, confused coward. I've spent my entire life on a set path. A to B to C. The right schools, the right job, the right girlfriend. I had a blueprint. I knew who I was supposed to be. And then, you." He stopped pacing and looked at me, his expression raw and unguarded. "Lying in your bed, night after night. It was the only time in months that I felt safe. The only time the noise in my head stopped. And that night, with the storm, I was lying there, and I realized I wasn't thinking about Sarah. I wasn't thinking about work. I was just thinking about how much I wanted to turn over and be closer to you. And that thought, it terrified me, because it felt more real than anything I've ever felt for anyone." He finally collapsed onto his sofa, burying his face in his hands. His voice was muffled. "So I kissed you, and it was like coming home. It felt right. It felt like the most honest thing I've ever done. And the second it was over, I panicked. Because what does that mean, Leo? What does it mean about me? About my whole life? I didn't know how to face you. I didn't know how to face myself. So I ran. I hid. Because I was hoping if I ignored it for long enough, the feeling would just go away, and did it?" I asked softly, my anger completely gone, replaced by a wave of empathy so profound it almost hurt. He looked up from his hands, and his eyes were glistening with unshed tears. "No," he whispered. "It's only gotten stronger." In that moment, all the pain and confusion of the last 2 weeks dissolved. I saw him not as the man who had hurt me, but as a man who was drowning in his own fear, terrified of a truth he couldn't yet name. I crossed the room and sat down next to him on the sofa. I didn't say anything. I just reached out and took his hand. His fingers were cold, but they laced through mine, gripping my hand like a lifeline. We sat there for a long time, in the messy, stale apartment, the silence no longer a weapon, but a space for healing. The confrontation was over. The confession had been made. And in its place, something new and fragile and terrifyingly hopeful was beginning to take root. The days that followed were tentative, like the first steps on a newly healed leg. We were navigating a new landscape without a map. The old, easy rhythm of our friendship was gone, replaced by a heightened awareness, a careful choreography of words and gestures. We started over, not as friends, but as something undefined. We talked. For hours and hours, we talked. We sat in my apartment, the place where our silent ritual had unfolded, and we filled it with words, with all the things we had left unsaid for years. He talked about his confusion, his fear of labels, his terror at dismantling the life he thought he was supposed to live. I talked about the years of quiet affection, the loneliness of loving him in secret, the pain his silence had caused. It was messy and difficult and honest. It was the necessary, painful work of excavating the foundations of our relationship to see if they were strong enough to build something new upon. Slowly, the fear began to recede, replaced by a quiet curiosity. We explored the physical side of our new connection with the same gentle hesitation that had defined that first kiss. A hand held while watching a movie. An arm slung around a shoulder while we walked down the street. Small, deliberate acts of affection that were both thrilling and comforting. We were learning a new language together, a language of touch that was no longer accidental or ambiguous, but intentional. Each gesture was a question and an answer, a confirmation that we were both still here, both still willing to try. The first time he stayed over after our talk, the tension was different. It wasn't the anxious, hopeful tension of before. It was a nervous, excited energy, the feeling of a first date. When it was time for bed, he paused at the door to my bedroom, a flicker of the old uncertainty in his eyes. Is this still okay?" he asked. I smiled and took his hand, leading him into the room. "It's more than okay," I said. That night, when we lay down, there was no chasm between us. He turned to face me immediately, and I met him in the middle. He pulled me into his arms, and I rested my head on his chest, listening to the steady, reassuring beat of his heart. There was no pretense of sleep. We just held each other, cocooned in the darkness, letting the simple, profound comfort of being together sink in. It was no longer a ritual born of necessity and denial. It was a choice, a conscious, deliberate choice to find our home in each other. The true resolution, the moment I knew we had truly found our footing, was not in a grand declaration or a passionate embrace. It was in the quiet, mundane moments of a shared life beginning to take shape. It was in the way he started leaving a toothbrush in my bathroom, a permanent fixture next to mine. It was in the way my apartment started to accumulate his things, a favorite coffee mug, a worn-out university sweatshirt, a stack of books on my nightstand. My space, once my solitary fortress, was slowly, willingly, becoming our space. The boundaries were dissolving, not with a crash, but with a gentle, welcome erosion. One Saturday morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee. I opened my eyes and saw Julian standing by the window, a mug in his hand, looking out at the city as the morning sun streamed in, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. He was wearing my old gray t-shirt and his own sweatpants, looking completely, effortlessly at home. He turned and saw me awake, and a slow, easy smile spread across his face. It was a smile I had seen 1,000 times, but this time, it was different. It was stripped of all the old anxieties, all the hidden turmoil. It was pure, unadulterated peace. "Morning," he said, his voice warm and soft. He walked over and sat on the edge of the bed, handing me the other mug he had brought. Our fingers brushed as I took it, a simple touch that still sent a quiet thrill through me. We sat there for a moment, sipping our coffee in a comfortable, easy silence. The bedroom door, which in the past had always been left ajar as a sort of symbolic escape hatch, was now firmly closed. We were enclosed in our own world, a sanctuary we had built together out of honesty and courage. And I thought about how we build our lives, how we think we have a blueprint, a clear path forward. But sometimes, the most beautiful structures are the ones that are built in the aftermath of a collapse, the ones that are pieced together from the rubble, creating something stronger and more honest than what was there before. We had been two separate, solitary beings, hiding in our own carefully constructed rooms. But now, we had knocked down the wall between us. We had begun to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together. The photograph was finally in focus, the image clear and true. It was just us, in the morning light, home.